When Jake inherited his grandfather's house, he thought his biggest challenge would be sorting through a lifetime of memories and dust. The quiet, isolated home stood as a monument to a simple life, a place of profound silence. But some silences are not empty, they are waiting. He was left a final, cryptic letter with a single bizarre rule concerning the rhythmic creaking from the floorboards above the basement. A rule he would come to understand was the only thing keeping a fragile, generations-old truce with an ancient listener in the stone below. A listener that is now awake and hungry to learn his sounds. Let's begin this story. Get comfortable and listen closely. The air in the house was thick with the scent of pine-scented cleaner, lemon polish, and the faint, underlying perfume of dust and time. It was the smell of his grandfather. Jake dropped a cardboard box labeled Kitchen, Misk, onto the linoleum floor, the sound echoing unnaturally in the stillness. For a man who had lived 82 years, his grandfather had been meticulously tidy. Yet the house was crowded with the sheer volume of a life lived entirely in one place. Jake's task was somber and logistical: to empty the nest, sell the property, and close the final chapter on a man he had respected, but, if he was being honest, barely knew. On the polished surface of the hall table, next to a ceramic ball of dusty, fake lemons, sat a single, cream-colored envelope. Jake's name was written on the front in his grandfather's spidery, deliberate script. Below it, a single line: "Read this last, after you've settled in." Jake picked it up. It felt light, insignificant. He slid it into his back pocket, another item on a long to-do list. The first day was a blur of sorting, packing, and memory. He found old photographs of his grandmother who had passed a decade ago, her smile bright and genuine. He found his own childhood drawings taped carefully to the back of a closet door. Each object was a small anchor to the past, pulling at him. By the time night fell, draping the rural Pennsylvania landscape in a deep, starless black, Jake was emotionally and physically exhausted. He microwaved a sad-looking frozen dinner and ate it standing in the kitchen, the silence of the house pressing in on him. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a heavy, weighted one, filled with the ghosts of conversations and the echoes of footsteps from decades past. He retreated to the guest's bedroom, the same one he used as a child. He lay in the dark, listening to the normal sounds of an old house breathing around him: the groan of wood settling, the tick of the radiator, the faint whisper of wind against the window pane. These were familiar, comforting sounds, the house's lullaby. He was just drifting off when he heard it. Creak, creak, creak. His eyes snapped open. It wasn't the random groan of old timber. This was a sound with a distinct rhythm, a pattern. It came from the hallway, somewhere near the front of the house. He sat up, straining his ears. The house fell silent again, save for the wind. He lay back down, chalking it up to his tired mind playing tricks on him. Then it came again, louder, more defined. Creak, creak, creak. It was a cadence, a 3-beat measure with a pause. It sounded deliberate. It sounded like a signal. Annoyance pricked at him. A loose floorboard was just one more thing to fix. As a carpenter, his mind immediately went to the mechanics of it. A board pulling away from a joist, the tongue and groove rubbing under pressure from temperature changes. He swung his legs out of bed, the mattress sighing under the shift in weight. The moment his bare foot touched the cold wood of the hallway floor, the sound stopped. Not faded, not tapered off, it ceased instantly, as if a switch had been flipped. He stood in the hallway, listening. Nothing. The silence had returned, but it felt different now, tense. He walked slowly down the hall, his footsteps the only sound. He stopped directly in front of the basement door. This was where the sound had seemed to be centered. He pressed down on the floorboards with his foot, one after another. A few of them gave a faint, tired groan, but none produced the specific rhythmic creak he'd heard. It was solid, old-growth oak, milled and laid when houses were built to outlast generations. He shook his head, a wry smile touching his lips. He was overtired, grieving, and staying in a strange old house. Of course he was hearing things. "It's just a house settling, old man," he whispered into the darkness, as if reassuring his grandfather's ghost. He turned and went to bed, pulling the covers up to his chin. He lay awake for another hour, listening, but the rhythmic creaking did not return. The house remained still, holding its breath. For the rest of the night, the only sound was the frantic beating of his own heart. The second night, it began at almost the exact same time, 11:47 p.m. Jake was reading in bed, a paperback propped on his knees, when the sound cut through the quiet. Creak, 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 creak. It was the same rhythm, the same resonant tone that seemed to vibrate not just in his ears, but deep in his chest. Tonight he didn't get up. He just lay there, listening, the words on the page blurring. It continued for nearly 20 minutes, a consistent, repeating phrase of sound. It was as maddening as a dripping faucet, but with an unnerving intentionality that a simple drip lacked. It was a song, and it was playing for an audience of one. By the fourth night, Jake's practicality was worn thin, frayed at the edges. The sound was no longer just an annoyance, it was an intrusion. It felt personal. During the day, he'd spent 2 hours in the hallway, prying at the edges of the boards with a putty knife, trying to isolate the source. He'd stomped, jumped, and crawled, pressing his ear to the wood, but he couldn't replicate the sound. It only happened at night, when the house was still, and only when he was in bed. The consistency was what truly unnerved him. It wasn't random. It was a ritual. Frustrated, sleep-deprived, and with a growing knot of anxiety in his stomach, he remembered the letter. He fished it out of the pocket of his dirty jeans, his thumb smudging the neat script. He sat at the kitchen table, the harsh overhead light making the cream-colored paper seem stark and important. He slid it open with a butter knife. The note inside was on the same stationery, written in the same hand, and it was chillingly brief. "Jake, there's a rule to this house. It's the most important thing I can ever tell you. My father told me, and his father told him. Now I'm telling you. The house makes sounds. The thing below listens. It has always listened. The sounds of the house, the sounds of a family living here, they are like a song to it, a lullaby. When the floorboards by the cellar doors sing their song, it means it is listening, and it is content. That specific sound, son, you'll know it. It means the truth holds. Whatever you do, never, ever go into the basement after the boards creak. Don't walk down the hall. Don't open the door. Don't let it hear you. Let it listen to the house. That is all it wants. Let it listen. Be safe. Grandpa." Jake read it 3 times. The paper trembled in his hand. This was impossible. It was the nonsensical rambling of an old man succumbing to dementia, a flight of fancy, a thing below. It sounded like a fairy tale, a boogeyman story to scare a child. His logical mind, the carpenter mind that understood wood and nails and physics, rebelled against every word. It was wood expanding and contracting, a loose joist, simple. But the letter, the specificity of it was a cold spike of fear in his gut. When the floorboards by the cellar doors sing their song. His grandfather had called it a song, and that's what it was. It wasn't a creak. It was a cadence, a rhythm, a song. The letter didn't just describe the sound, it understood it. A war ignited inside him. His entire life was built on a foundation of practicality, of measurable, tangible things. A house was a structure of wood and stone. A sound was a vibration, traveling through a medium. But the letter offered a different, terrifying reality. It suggested the house wasn't just a structure, but a membrane, a thin layer of wood and plaster separating the world he knew from something else, something that listened. That night, when the creaking started at 11:47 p.m., Jake didn't hear an architectural flaw, he heard a lullaby. And for the first time in his life, he felt a deep, primal fear of what might happen if the music stopped. For 3 nights, Jake obeyed the rule. He stayed in his room, the door shut, and listened to the floorboards sing their nightly song. Creak, 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 creak. The sound was no longer just unnerving. It was a source of profound dread and a bizarre, perverse fascination. He found himself timing it, cataloging its near-perfect consistency. The fear was real, a cold weight in his stomach. But another part of him, the stubborn, rational part, felt like a fool. He was a grown man cowering in a bedroom because of a spooky story from his grandfather and a noisy floor. It was absurd. The skepticism was an itch he had to scratch. He needed to prove it was just a house. He needed to see the strings on the ghost. On the 8th night of his stay, he made his decision. He waited, his heart thumping a frantic rhythm against his ribs, until the nightly performance began. Creak, 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 creak. The sound filled the hallway, a familiar rhythmic pulse. This time, however, Jake swung his legs out of bed. He didn't put his feet down. He sat on the edge of the mattress, listening, waiting. He had to be sure. The song continued, steady and constant. Taking a deep, shaky breath, he stood up. His bare feet met the floorboards. He walked out of the bedroom and into the hall. The song continued. Creak, 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 creak. He took a step towards the basement door. And another. The rhythmic sound was loud now, right under his feet, a vibration he could feel through the soles of his feet. He reached the door, his hand trembling as he wrapped it around the cold, brass knob. He took one last look down the dark hallway, then turned the knob, pulled the door open, and flicked the basement light switch. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The creaking didn't fade or trail off. It stopped. It was as if a cord had been brutally cut, a speaker blown. The abrupt cutoff was more shocking than the sound itself. And in its place descended a silence so profound, so heavy, it felt like a physical pressure. The air in the hallway grew instantly, noticeably colder, raising goosebumps on his arms. The normal ambient hum of the house was gone. There was no radiator tick, no hum from the refrigerator in the kitchen, no whisper of wind. There was only this dead, watchful void. Jake stood frozen at the top of the stairs, his knuckles white on the doorknob. He peered down into the basement. A single bare bulb cast a weak yellow light over the steep wooden steps and the stone-walled space below. He could see his grandfather's workbench, neatly organized tools hanging from a pegboard, old paint cans stacked against the wall, the concrete floor dusty and gray. It was just a basement, an ordinary, musty basement. There was nothing there. But the feeling in the house had fundamentally changed. The previous silence had been peaceful, empty. This silence was not empty. It was focused. It was attentive. It was the silence of a predator that has just noticed its prey. His heart hammered in his chest. He had done it. He had broken the rule. He slammed the basement door shut, the sound booming in the oppressive stillness, and fumbled to lock the deadbolt. He backed away, his eyes wide, staring at the door as if a monster were about to smash through it. He retreated to the living room, collapsing on the sofa but unable to rest. He sat in the dark for what felt like an eon, waiting for something, for the creaking to return, for anything. But the unnatural silence held. It was a suffocating blanket over the house. After an hour that stretched into an eon, he heard a new sound. It was very faint, coming from beyond the basement door. A slow, dragging, scraping sound. It was the sound of something heavy being pulled across a rough surface. It was the sound of stone on stone, and it was coming from below. The lullaby was over. The nightly routine of the creaking floorboards, which had become strangely comforting in its predictability, was gone. It had been replaced by a new, terrifying soundtrack. The scraping sound from the basement was intermittent, unpredictable. Sometimes it was a slow, deliberate shriff, shriff, like a heavy burial stone being dragged across a crypt floor. Other times it was a series of short, sharp scratches. It never lasted long, but it always came when the house was at its quietest, a chilling reminder of what he had done. The silence that followed these episodes was worse. It was a listening silence. Jake started to feel as if he were a specimen under a microscope. He began to hear other things too. Faint tapping sounds that seemed to come from within the walls, from the copper water pipes and the foundation itself. At first, he dismissed it as the house settling in a new way. But then he noticed a pattern. When he walked from the living room to the kitchen, a few seconds later he'd hear a soft tap, 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 from the pipes in the wall, seemingly tracing his path. When he sat still, the house was still. When he moved, the house's bones moved with him. The physical manifestations began on the third morning after he'd opened the door. He came out of the bedroom to find a fine, gray dust, almost like powdered stone or fine ash, laid in a perfectly straight line on the floor beneath the basement door. It hadn't been there when he'd locked it. He stared at it, his blood running cold. It was a line drawn in the sand, a boundary, a message. He cleaned it up, his hands shaking, but it was there again the next morning. Then came the vibrations. He'd be sitting at the kitchen table and an object on a shelf would suddenly rattle, not from a passing truck or a tremor, but from a single, sharp thump that seemed to originate from directly below his feet, as if a giant had struck the underside of the foundation with a massive fist. He couldn't take it anymore. The isolation and the mounting fear were eroding his sanity. He called Sarah. The phone felt like a lifeline to a world that made sense, a world without listening basements and malevolent silence. "Jake, are you okay? You sound awful," she said, her voice warm and full of concern. He tried to explain, but the words came out in a torrent, a jumbled mess of creaking boards, an old letter, and scraping sounds. He knew how he sounded. Paranoid. Unhinged. A thing below? Jake, honey, you're exhausted. It's an old house. You're grieving. You need to get out of there, just for a day. Come back to the city, she pleaded. You don't understand, Sarah. It's real. I broke a rule. A truce or something. He insisted, his voice cracking. It's listening to me. It's following me. As he spoke, a slow scraping sound began from the basement, louder than before. Shh, shh. It was faint, but the phone's microphone was sensitive enough to pick it up. "What is that?" Sarah's voice dropped to a terrified whisper. "What is that noise?" "That's it," Jake hissed, holding the phone toward the hallway. "That's the sound." The scraping stopped. On the other end of the line, Sarah was silent for a moment. Then she spoke, her voice strained with fear. "Jake, I don't know what that was, but it didn't sound like a house settling. Get out. Now. I'm serious. Pack a bag and leave the house right now." But he couldn't. A stubborn, fearful part of him refused. This was his family's home. His grandfather had lived with this his entire life. It was his mess to fix. "I can't," he said, his voice low. "I have to understand what I've done." He hung up before she could argue, leaving him more alone than ever, with only the watchful silence and the thing in the stone for company. Jake's refusal to leave was born of fear, but also of a desperate need for answers. If his grandfather had lived with this, he must have left more behind than one cryptic letter. He bypassed the neatly labeled boxes in the house and went straight for the one place a man like his grandfather would have kept his real secrets: the workshop in the garage. It was a sanctuary of sawdust, oil, and organized chaos. And there, tucked away on a high shelf behind a row of rusted coffee cans filled with screws and nails, he found them: 3 thick, leather-bound journals. He took them to the kitchen table, the only place he felt remotely safe, and opened the first one. The ink was faded, the date written in his grandfather's younger, stronger hand, 1968. For hours, Jake read, completely engrossed, the world outside the windows ceasing to exist. The journals laid bare the terrifying truth of the house, a secret passed down not in words, but in practiced silence and vigilance. His grandfather wrote of the listener below, or the stillness in the stone. It was not a ghost or a demon, but something far older, something geological and chthonic. The house, his great-grandfather had discovered too late, had been built inadvertently over a unique geological formation, a cave system or focal point where this ancient blind entity resided. It was largely non-corporeal, perceiving the world above not through sight or traditional senses, but purely through sound and vibration. The normal sounds of a family living above, the thud of footsteps, the murmur of voices, the rattle of dishes, the settling of the house's frame, had become its world. Over a century, these chaotic but constant vibrations had acted as a lullaby, keeping the entity dormant, content in its strange vibrational dream. The rhythmic creaking of the floorboards was the key. It was a sound the house had developed over decades, a harmonic resonance that the listener found particularly soothing. It was the sign that all was well, that the lullaby was working. In return for this constant symphony of life, the journals explained, the house and its inhabitants received a strange passive protection. The foundation never settled or cracked. Severe storms and blizzards always seemed to weaken just as they reached the property line. The family that lived within the house's aura was blessed with unusual health and resilience. It was a bizarre, unconscious symbiosis. But the journals were filled with stark, terrifying warnings about what happened if the listener's attention was drawn by a new, sharp, or deliberate sound. It is like a blind man in a dark room. It ignores the ambient noise, but if you clap your hands, it will turn its head. It seeks the source of new sounds. It tries to learn them. It tries to understand them. It tries to touch them. Jake's blood ran cold when he found the entry from 1983. He remembered his cousin, David. David was 6. He was playing in the hall and dropped a glass marble. We all heard it. the tink, 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 as it bounced down the wooden cellar stairs. A new sound, a sharp sound. That night, the scraping began, the tapping. It followed him for a month. He woke up screaming every night, saying the floor was trying to talk to him. He never came to visit again. To this day, he can't sleep without a fan on, a fear of the quiet branded into him. A single marble, a child's mistake, had caused a month of terror. Jake closed the journal, his hands clammy. He hadn't dropped a marble. He had deliberately walked into its listening space, flooded it with artificial light, and slammed a door. His intrusion wasn't a mistake. It was a declaration. He had not just clapped his hand in the dark room. He had screamed his name directly into the blind man's ear. The nature of the sounds from the basement began to change. The scraping and tapping were no longer random. They were becoming intelligent. They were becoming personal. The listener was a quick study. One evening, as Jake paced nervously from the living room to the kitchen and back, he stopped dead in his tracks. From below, he heard a faint but distinct tapping sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was the exact rhythm of his own footsteps on the floorboards above. He stood perfectly still, and the tapping stopped. He took 3 quick steps. A moment later, 3 quick taps answered from the stone below. It was mimicking him. The feeling of being watched was replaced by something infinitely worse. The feeling of being studied. The mimicry grew more complex, more terrifying. During his next call with Sarah, his voice strained and panicked. He could hear it. Faintly from beneath his feet, the tapping from the foundation wasn't just random. It was echoing the cadence of his speech, the rise and fall of his frantic sentences. The entity was actively learning the sounds he made. It was building a vocabulary of his fear. It started trying to lure him back, to the door, to the basement. One night, the scraping and tapping ceased entirely. After an hour of tense silence, a new sound began. Creak, 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 creak. It was a flawless imitation of the old floorboard song, a false signal of peace, a siren's call made of rubbing wood. Jake stood in the hallway, his body trembling, torn between a desperate hope that things had returned to normal and the terrifying certainty that it was a trap. He stayed in the living room, and after an hour, the false creaking stopped, replaced by a single violent thump against the foundation directly under him, a clear expression of the entity's frustration. Another night, it tried a different tactic. He heard a sound that chilled him to his very soul, the faint, muffled sound of a woman weeping. It seemed to come from right behind the basement door. It was a primal, predatory trick, preying on the most basic human instinct to help someone in distress. He knew it was fake. He knew it was the entity using some half-remembered sound it had absorbed over the years, but his body still reacted, his muscles tensing, his heart aching with the manufactured pity. The grandfather's journals had mentioned one specific area, a section of the basement stone foundation along the back wall that had been walled off with a crude layer of brick and mortar by his great-grandfather, a patch of new material on an ancient wall. That is its ear, the journal read, the place where the stone is thinnest, where it listens most intently. All the sounds were loudest there, the scraping, the tapping, the horrifying mimicry. Jake found himself drawn to the hallway above that part of the house, listening, picturing the blind, ancient thing on the other side of the stone and concrete, scraping away at the mortar, trying to get closer to the source of the new sounds, closer to him.
The mimicry reached its horrifying apex. The entity was no longer just repeating his sounds, it was using them to compose a symphony of his terror. One night, as he sat frozen on the couch, he heard it tap out the frantic, stuttering rhythm of his own panicked heartbeat. Tap, 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 tap. Then he heard a low, dragging scrape that sounded exactly like his own ragged, shallow breathing. The house groaned around him, the foundation itself seeming to vibrate in resonance with his fear. Jake finally understood. The listener wasn't just learning, it was trying to connect. It was trying to resonate with him, to match his vibrations, to bridge the gap of stone and wood between them. He could feel it in his bones, a psychic pressure that made his teeth ache and his thoughts fray. His sanity was unraveling with every mimicked sound. He was being tuned like an instrument. He couldn't just leave. The journals had been grimly clear on that point. An entity this ancient and powerful, once focused on a specific source, might not be contained by something as simple as property lines. What if its attention followed him? What if he brought this listening horror into the world, attaching it to his own sonic signature? The thought was paralyzing. He had to put it back to sleep. He had to restore the lullaby. He couldn't fix the floorboards. That was a delicate, decades-old harmony. He needed a new sound, a constant, complex, overwhelming source of vibrations to distract it, to soothe it, to drown him out. His desperation sparked a frantic, brilliant plan. He wasn't going to fight the entity. He was going to overwhelm its senses. He was going to fight sound with sound. The climax was not a battle, but a desperate act of creation. Jake scrambled through the house, a man possessed. He was a conductor assembling a chaotic orchestra. From the attic, he dragged down 2 old clock radios, tuning them to the hissing static between stations. He found his grandfather's old wind-up mantel clock, its ticking a loud, insistent metronome. In a closet, he discovered his old high school acoustic guitar. He propped it against a chair and turned a small desk fan on it, the breeze making the strings hum in a low, continuous drone. He grabbed every pot and pan from the kitchen and hung them from the light fixture, where they would rattle with the house's vibrations. He turned on the television to a 24-hour news channel, the cacophony of voices and theme music adding to the din. He put the phone on the floor, playing a 10-hour loop of city sounds, traffic, sirens, chatter at full volume. He arranged his collection throughout the first floor, concentrating them in the hallway near the basement door. He was building a wall of noise, a multi-layered, disorganized, but continuous flood of vibrations. He was creating chaos to drown out the terrifyingly focused symphony of his own fear. He turned on the final device, a small whirring electric razor he'd found in the bathroom. As its buzz joined the chorus, the reaction from the basement was immediate and violent. The scraping and tapping became a frantic, chaotic storm of confused noise. It sounded like a hailstorm of rocks, a landslide of stone and fury. The entire house began to shake violently, not with the rhythm of the entity, but with the shuddering of its overload. The listener, the ancient being of stillness and sound, was being overwhelmed, drowned in a flood of new, unstructured, meaningless vibrations. It was a sonic assault, and Jake stood in the middle of it, praying it would be enough. The cacophony raged for over an hour. Jake sat on the living room floor, his hands over his ears, his body trembling with the house. The storm of noise from the basement was a constant, furious roar. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, it began to fade. The frantic scraping lessened, the chaotic tapping softened, the violent shaking of the house subsided into a low tremor, and then into stillness. The angry, overwhelmed noise from the basement was replaced by nothing. The silence that returned was different from the ones that had come before. It was not peaceful and it was not watchful. It was the stunned, empty silence of a battlefield after the fighting stops. The only sounds were from the symphony of noise Jake had created, the static, the ticking, the humming, the endless city sounds. With trembling hands, Jake began the painstaking process of disarming his creation. He turned off the buzzing razor first, then the TV. He unplugged the radios, silencing their static. Each flick of a switch, each silenced device plunged the house deeper into a quiet that was thick with dread. He waited, listening, after each one. The silence from below held. Finally, only one sound remained, the loud, insistent ticking of his grandfather's mantel clock. He held his breath and carefully stopped the pendulum. Absolute, terrifying silence. He stood in the middle of the living room for a minute, then 5, then 20. His own breathing was an explosion in the stillness. He was waiting for the scraping to start again, for the angry thump against the foundation. He was waiting for the punishment. And then he heard it. It was faint at first, a hesitant, woody sigh. Then it grew stronger, more confident, more familiar. Creak, 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 creak. The song, the rhythmic, soothing song of the floorboards had returned. Tears of relief streamed down Jake's face. He had done it. He hadn't broken the listener. He had simply reset it. He had washed away his own sound signature with a tidal wave of noise, and the entity had returned to the only thing that made sense, the lullaby. The truth was restored. Jake didn't sleep. He sat on the couch until dawn, listening to the creaking. It was the most beautiful and terrifying sound he had ever heard. The moment the first gray light of morning touched the windows, he was in motion. He packed a single bag. He left the humming guitar fan on, and he reset the mantel clock, its gentle ticking a soft, continuous offering, a small, permanent addition to the lullaby, just in case. He walked out of the house and didn't look back. He now understood that his grandfather's life had not been of one of simple quiet, but of constant, careful maintenance of a terrifying symbiotic relationship. As he drove away, he called Sarah, his voice steady for the first time in days. He said, "I'm coming home." Months later, Jake was living in his 4th-floor apartment in the city. He was a light sleeper now, hyper-aware of every sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the groan of the elevator, the traffic outside. They were his new lullaby. He had surrounded himself with noise. But one night, he was woken by a sound from within his own apartment. The old steam pipes in the wall were groaning and ticking as they cooled. It was a normal sound, a sound he'd heard 1,000 times. But this time, it had a pattern. Groan, tick, tick, groan. He froze in his bed, his eyes wide in the darkness, his heart hammering against his ribs. The rhythm was all wrong, but the cadence was unmistakable. He was listening to the song of old pipes and settling walls, and he recognized the terrifying silence that was waiting just beneath it.